Reaper is a very fun job to look at in Endwalker. Obviously, it's one of 2 new jobs introduced in the expansion, the other being Sage. It's also a melee DPS, which are among the most popular and include the most job variety, at least as of Endwalker. Adding on, it also uses maiming gear, which before in Shadowbringers, only Dragoons could wear. So going into Endwalker, one could expect that Reaper would be a pretty popular pick for raiding content. I myself actually used Reaper throughout all of Asphodelos. Obviously, I wasn't raiding during Shadowbringers, so I don't have that knowledge of melee beforehand, but we can look at Dragoon for a bit more insight on maiming DPS going into Endwalker. And looking at the last 2 Eden raids, Dragoon finds itself cemented around the mid to upper mid tier in terms of usage. This is relevant again because Reaper uses the same gear as Dragoon. If someone's playing a Dragoon in Shadowbringers, they have no other jobs to swap to easily. But that changed going into Endwalker. Personally, I really enjoy Reaper. I know some people aren't a fan of the more simple rotation, however, it's really the pacing and the mobility that really make it for me. During Prague, I had a really good time just figuring out when the best times to use my resources were, and the burst window is really satisfying. Communio! Like the other state of videos, we're not exactly looking at performance or damage output. I may bring it up when I feel it's relevant, but only then. With the state of series, we more or less look at the popularity of certain jobs in terms of high-end raiding content. Think Savage and Ultimate. And we do this through FF logs, an imperfect, albeit still viable way to look at how raiders use certain jobs. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the data and find out how raiders have received Reaper during Endwalker. Starting with Asphodelos. Far and away, Reaper has the most parses. This is literally because it's a new job. And looking at its damage, it's actually behind all the other melee DPS minus Ninja. As we've established before in this series, most of the time in raiding, a majority of players don't take damage into account when picking the jobs they use for Prague. There's only one tier in Endwalker where I can say confidently that balancing is a factor, and it's not Asphodelos. But moving on to 6.1, it's mostly the same story. Reaper is still the most used melee job, but it's second overall for DPS behind Summoner. That's a bit weird. Let's actually look at the patch notes for 6.1, and wouldn't you know, there are a lot of different buffs and little tweaks to all jobs in 6.1. That makes sense, it's the first patch of a new expansion, there is a lot of feedback coming through. And while our own dear Reaper only got a few animation adjustments and a minor buff to Harp, Summoner got a whole slew of potency buffs, which explains why it's the most logged DPS in 6.1. Now we can move on to Reaper's first ultimate, Dragon Song's Reprise, and it's not doing too well, being in the bottom 3 for logs. The top 2 were actually really interesting. Number 1 is Dancer, and number 2 is Ninja. It really goes to show that there's more than raw damage when it comes to picking a job in Ultimates. Every fight has their own little quirks, and that makes certain jobs more viable. Reaper would continue to be in the bottom 3 going into 6.2, despite receiving a few minor potency buffs. When it comes to Ultimates, I'm not going to go too in depth. I haven't done Ultimates in Endwalker, so I can't speak to them personally. Therefore, I don't want to say a lot, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. I feel like that makes sense. Abyssos. This is the tier where I hypothesize that damage does matter, at least as far as tanking goes. But does that trend extend to DPS specs as well? While looking at the data, sort of. Samurai is far and away the spec with the highest DPS, and it is the most logged DPS spec. But Monk is in second place for damage in terms of melee, and it's on the bottom 4. With our Reaper, it's somewhere in the middle. At this point, the hype has died down, raiders are less interested, the new toy is less shiny. But it's not doing bad, it's just kind of mid. I guess balancing with Abyssos was really more of a tank issue than anything. From what I can see at least, there's a bit more variety between DPS specs, unless you're a machinist. And 6.3 Abyssos Reaper's numbers went up, despite not receiving any job changes. We can infer that this is due to raiders re-clearing or doing alt runs with gear. It's best not to dwell on damage too much, there are a lot of factors that can change, including tuning, gear, and boss design. As always, I try to bring it up when I think it's relevant. Speaking of staying relevant, could I trouble you to hit the like button? I put in a lot of work on this channel, and this video liking lets me know I'm on the right track. Also, we are closing in on 700 subscribers, so help a brother out. Thanks, team. The next piece of content to look at is Omega Protocol, and it's a pretty similar story for Reaper in 6.3. In terms of melee, it's the second most used next to Ninja, and its damage output is pretty solid as well. And this trend continues on to our current patch 6.4. I don't have a lot to say when it comes to TOP. Like I said before, it's not exactly a fight I'm familiar with, so I won't really waste your time. I won't dwell on it. The only takeaway is that Reaper seems to be more used now than it was back in 6.2. However, we are up to the current raid tier and Abyssos. a very well-received raid tier. And when it comes to Reaper's usage, it's again somewhere in the upper mid-tier. One thing I haven't pointed out is that Reaper is more often than not picked over its counterpart, Dragoon. Again, both use the same gear, and while the best in slot does change, it's a lot easier to swap jobs when you're wearing the same gear. It's one of the reasons a lot of raiders say you're picking a role instead of a job. But looking at all of the encounters throughout Endwalker, what can we take away in regards to the state of Reaper and its popularity in high-end raiding content? Well, obviously at the start, everyone wanted a piece of Reaper. That is to be expected. It's the only new DPS job introduced in Endwalker, but after the dust settled, Reaper started to fall behind a bit. Players had their fun, on to the next job. And that's where we see Reaper start to fall a little bit. This is in 6.1, 6.2. After 6.3, however, it looks like Reaper started to find its player base, with more and more players picking up the job over other popular picks like Ninja. And now, nearing the end of Endwalker's life cycle, Reaper finds itself in a solid spot among the other melee DPS jobs. In fact, it's actually in a similar spot compared to Dragoon and Shadowbringers. The two are never really far off from each other. Again, in a game where you are more or less choosing a role instead of a job, it's still neat to compare the two over time. But that's all I got, folks. Watch this video on screen and subscribe.